What up guys, Otterpop here and welcome to the final Dan vs. review. Well, the final season 1, the review for the finale of season 1, the final review of the season for Dan. Give me a moment. Yes, this is the review for a particular episode that I'm sure a lot of people have been looking forward to. This apparently tends to be one of the favorite episodes of even the regular Dan vs. fandom. This is the review for Season 1, Episode 22, and yes, that is correct, this is intended to be the season finale. Dan vs. Dan, or as some of the Dandom know it, Dan vs. the Impostor, or Dan vs. Impostor, something like that. But yes, this is going to be the final review of Dan vs. for a while. I will be reacting to Season 2 eventually and doing reviews for that, but I'm at least going to take a break so that I can focus on South Park, which, you know, I'm sure a lot of people have been looking forward to. But first off, as usual, the link to the reaction is going to be down in the description below, so go ahead and follow that link, or you can watch this review right here. I've actually got some interesting things to talk about, so we'll see how long this goes, because this was one of the best episodes I've had so far for analyzing characters specifically, and even more specifically, character relationships. I mean, there are two big categories that I'm talking about, and there are some miscellaneous things as well, but oh man, did I have a lot to analyze. Now at this point, I've recognized that my opinions, my ideals, and my analyses tend to be a lot different from a lot of the, fan base, which kind of makes sense, because in a weird way, I'm not necessarily the target audience for this, but I can also look at it from a completely different perspective. So, a lot of people may be looking forward to me watching or reviewing this one particular episode, but I tend to favor this episode a little bit more, something like that, something along those lines. But that's kind of natural for me, because I look at this as somebody who doesn't always get humor, but who is very analytical, who loves fiction, who loves writing, who is a writer and an artist, so I look at all different kinds of things that most people wouldn't necessarily, and that's probably what makes these reviews a lot different. But man, was this such a fun episode for character and relationship analyses. Again, two big ones in particular. Oh yeah, duh, almost completely forgot about the recap. Silly me. So, quick recap of the episode. Seems a friendly imposter is impersonating Dan, intending on stealing Dan's identity, and Dan needs to do something about it to get his life back. Now, of course, there are all kinds of little details that happen throughout this episode, but there are two big things that happens. One is a bit more of a deep dive into Dan's personality, more than I've done in the past. And I know that I've talked about his intelligence or his patchwork of knowledge in the past a bunch, but in particular, I'm very focused on his personality. Even before the title card appears on the screen, Dan apparently drives through a church. Drives through a friggin' church. And it's implied he drove over a nun, or at least he had no qualms with potentially driving over one. It was a little bit tricky to tell with the dialogue exactly what happened. He drove into a church and maybe over a nun, or didn't hit a nun, or I don't know, something like that, but oh my word. I knew from the very beginning, and I knew over the course of time, that all he was basically just an angry little man-child who had a bunch of random knowledge and didn't understand lots of even simple concepts sometimes. But I never actually thought of him being some kind of, not sadist, what's the word I'm looking for? Sociopath, or psychopath. It never even crossed my mind throughout the entirety of this season that I might even consider him some kind of sociopath or psychopath or kind of related path type individual. But hearing about what he was saying at court, how he doesn't seem to have any problems with driving through a church, or doesn't seem to have a problem with driving over a nun, whether he actually did or not, or so, I don't know. The dialogue was kind of weird to figure out, but it wasn't until now where I started to think about something like that. He does seem to have empathy, but it seems very limited. But maybe not quite on the level of a sociopath or psychopath, because that's basically little to no empathy for anyone or anything. But he clearly has a dear love for Miss Mumbles. So there is that. But I don't know, I worry about his personality sometimes. It's almost quirky and interesting, and on occasion charming. Even some of the negative aspects of his personality. I can't really explain it any better than that. But this was the first time where I got a little bit, nervous by his personality. I'm not really sure what personality trait I would classify that as. I'm thinking of a specific word, and I've been trying to think of that word for hours and hours, and I'm not even joking about that, but I can't think of the freaking word as to what specific personality trait that it is that I'm trying to think of when I think about him not having any problems with, causing property damage to that scale and potentially even human damage as well. I don't know. I don't even know if anybody's gonna be able to help me with the word. I've been trying to think of it, and I just can't freaking think of it. I know that there's a word I'm trying to think of, but I can't think of it. Anyways, moving on to some slightly different matters. Dan eventually gets brought to a shrink against his will by both Chris and Elise, but the shrink turns out not to work, even though it's basically been said that this shrink deals with the hardest of the hard cases and seems to know Elise pretty well, so that should give you a clue as to how good he is with, if he kind of works with her sometimes, but it doesn't work, and it's strongly implied, well, it's kind of basically stated that Dan talked about his childhood, and that's what made the shrink shriek and leave. There have been hints about his parents, or at least what kinds of parents they were. They definitely were fairly irresponsible. They didn't really care too much about his well-being or something along those lines. But I just want to know if we are ever going to know anything about what kind of sick, tragic, depraved, ridiculous, nonsensical childhood that he had. Are we ever going to get some inside information onto that? I want to see that. I want to see how he ended up this way. I want to see why he ended up this way and how he survived for this freaking long with such limited knowledge and not a care in the world for how to be a contributing member of society as my parents have raised my sister and I. I want to know more about what happened in his childhood. And damn it, if that doesn't happen in seasons 2 or 3, it better happen in a revival in season 4, because I need to know stuff. I mean, granted, I may not necessarily ever find out technically, because this is more episodic, so it's supposed to reveal maybe some little things over time. Maybe it's not supposed to go into character analyses or stuff like that. But again, I'm a writer. This is the kind of stuff that I gush over, that I live for, that I exist for. That's kind of stuff that really gets me. I want to know more about what happened to him as a child. And yeah, I know that technically just made the shrink just kind of shriek and leave, but I don't care because I still want to know. I've come up with some pretty messed up backstories for some of my own characters of my own stories. Nothing surprises me. Okay, maybe I won't go so far as to say that nothing surprises me, but I've heard of some pretty terrible backstories and childhoods and personalities and stuff, and I've created plenty of bad ones as well. So I do want to know. I've said it once, I'll say it a million times. Dan is such a man-child. Apparently he draws unflattering drawings of Elise in a secret little journal. Wow! That's like 3rd grade level nonsense right there. I swear, I mentioned in a previous review, I feel like he's just mentally stunted at I was thinking maybe he mentally stopped at high school, but I'd wager maybe even mentally stopped at middle school. Maybe even earlier, who frickin' knows, but really? You're gonna draw unflattering drawings of Elise? And, she was understandably a little bit mad. Hey, I would be too. I'd be like, can I see? Can I see? So I know how hard to kick your ass? Dan really is such a sad character sometimes, and even the Impostor finds Dan to be quite sad sometimes, especially knowing that Dan didn't know Miss Mumble's true gender until, someone else, Hello Man, ended up pointing it out to him. Even the Impostor thought that. He seems like such a sad character, but at the same time, he's so lively with his anger that it kind of makes you think, no, you're not really sad, you're just... And it's not even pathetic, too. But it is definitely ridiculous. Despite that, if anything, I guess I've sort of started to become accustomed to various aspects of Dan's personality. When Dan was trying to, show everybody that he was turning around a new leaf since, this imposter was taking over his identity and Dan was coming up with his new identity, Biff Wellington, by the way. Beef Wellington. Biff Wellington. Wow, just... It was so funny. It was so ridiculous. But even when he was trying to adopt that new persona, even I knew almost immediately that there was something going on. It was all a ruse, and it wasn't real. And even Elise was starting to suspect, like, pretty shortly after I did. But Elise and I were on the same page. We're just like, no. We know Dan well enough to know that he is not just gonna give up. I didn't necessarily know how it was a ruse, but I was at least happy to. I'm at least happy to admit that I was right in, assuming that there was some kind of plan or sneaky concoction that Dan had cooked up for, the imposter. But even by the end of the episode, this was the first episode I had experienced throughout the entirety of the series where I actually pitied Dan a little bit. Especially as the imposter was pointing out all these kinds of things about what Dan's life was like, how he didn't even know Miss Mumble's true gender, him not taking care of his place, him being angry at everything, and, having a revenge list or something like that. Even the imposter was pointing out so many things about Dan that really cast him in a sort of pathetic and pitiful light. And it's not like something that I hadn't necessarily seen, but it was never really the sole focus of an episode until this particular one. And I think because of that, I really began to pity Dan for him, as a character, for who he was. And if you can get me to feel pity for a character that's angry at everything and is such a freaking man-child about everything, congratulations, creators. That's a little bit impressive. At least from a writer's perspective. That's a little bit impressive. And there's actually something else that I was kind of thinking about, at least after the reaction for the most part, because the whole episode focuses around an imposter stealing Dan's identity because of Dan's isolated and angry nature. I find this unlikely, but it would be interesting to somehow bring it up at some point. Or, to bring it up in, even just a couple, maybe even multiple future episodes, whether Dan ends up changing in some way, shape, or form as a result, or at least trying to change in some way as a result of this particular episode. Again, because of its episodic nature, I find it very unlikely. From a writer's perspective, something like that would be a little bit interesting, but don't necessarily take my word for it, because frankly, morality, well, okay, not morality necessarily. I'm not even gonna touch that because Dan doesn't even fall in that same boat. But one of the biggest hooks for me with just about any character is character growth. That is absolutely one of the biggest hooks. I do the exact same thing with my own stories and my own characters that I create, is I tend to favor the ones that either have strong morals and personalities, or those that go through significant character growth. For a reason, at least. You can't just go through character growth and just be like, we'll just explain it away, and, this happened, so this character grew in this way, and it's like, no. You gotta do it with finesse and with elegance. Again, I find it very unlikely that such a thing would happen with Dan as a result of this particular episode, these events, or that character. But, speaking of the imposter, it was actually really interesting to know the imposter is actually a fan favorite among the Dan versus fandom. So that kind of means two things. One is they sort of considered him, technically one of three things. One, they considered him a really good villain, which kind of makes sense. Because if you think about it, the imposter put Dan in a really precarious situation and really began to make light of his angry and sad and pitiful character, not even just to Chris and Elise, but even to the audience as well, as if it was something we hadn't really thought about or hadn't really paid much attention to because it was never the focus of an episode. So yes, either the fandom considered him a strong enough villain, because apparently the Dan vs. fandom really likes villains. Two, he could potentially the imposter could appear in future episodes, maybe even being on the same level as, say, a recurring character. Or three, it could be a combination of the first two. I'm not entirely sure. I'm leaning towards the third option, but I'm not entirely sure. I think for sure the first option. Because if you think about it, the imposter really is such an intriguing, villain not necessarily villain, but I definitely put him on the role of antagonist. Villain is a very common term, and, I use it myself plenty of times, but, writers tend to use the more colloquial term antagonist for this particular kind of role. The imposter was honestly a really interesting antagonist, and it would be interesting to see more of him, whether he's, against Dan or with Dan, or some kind of maybe in between with Dan or something like that. It would be really interesting, especially given how this interaction between the two of them turned out, with, the imposter getting arrested in Dan's place. But the fact that the imposter was able to manipulate almost every aspect of Dan's life in some way to adhere to him so that he could better steal the identity. It really was a brilliant plan if you think about it. The imposter only stole Dan's identity because Dan doesn't really have any strong connections and pretty much everybody hates him, so it's like nobody's gonna notice, nobody's gonna miss him if he's gone, nobody's gonna care to report any unusual suspicious activity because, he was an angry guy that nobody really cared about or knew, and so this imposter is basically taking Dan's place and is taking over his life. The imposter even gets like Miss Mumbles on his side in a sort of weird kind of way, because at least Miss Mumbles doesn't seem to be helping Dan, which I think just furthers the idea. It enhances the idea that this guy means business and that he is a legitimate threat to Dan. But because of all those factors, he makes a fantastic antagonist, and seeing him as an antagonist again, or even a recurring character in the future, would be really interesting to look at. Again, I'm still leaning toward that third option of him being a recurring character and just being a fantastic antagonist from the very start. So, we'll see what happens. And that's just freaking stuff about Dan himself. That's only one big part of this entire episode that I was, especially focused on, because there was another big part of this episode that I was really focused on, and that was specifically the relationship between Dan and Chris. Because of their differing personalities, I find Chris and Dan's relationship to be so interesting to analyze and examine from all different kinds of perspectives. It's so fascinating. I still wonder to this day why Chris even puts up with Dan, and I still think it would be interesting if we got a sort of Dan versus Chris episode or something like that. That would be fascinating. That would be really cool to see, especially given how weird and strained and yet strong at the same point that their relationship really is. And this episode, oh my goodness, there were so many little things that were happening here and there that continued to make me question the relationship between Chris and Dan, especially because it seemed like Chris was, in a variety of ways, taking more of the imposter's side than Dan's. Again, in weird ways, but in a variety of ways. I mean, firstly, as soon as Dan told Chris about the imposter, Chris doesn't immediately believe him like usual, but he also doesn't immediately just kind of start helping Dan out of, non-reluctance or anything like he doesn't, push back, or he doesn't believe him in any, like he would in most usual episodes, but instead tries to do a deep dive into Dan's actions and explain them away, suggesting that, even going so far as to suggesting that Dan has multiple personalities? But come on, Chris should know better. He should not be doing the same thing that I do with these episodes. That's not Chris. Chris is not that smart, and frankly, Chris should know better. That seems like an Elise thing to do, but that does not seem like a Chris thing to do, so I was already questioning things right away from the very beginning. I was like, I think I was trying to look appalled in the reaction because I'm like, Chris, what are you doing? And then it seems like Chris literally seems to take the imposter's side for pie and ice cream. And I wish I was joking about that. I mean, of course it's freaking food, but the imposter makes an amazing pie and has some ice cream on the side, and Chris, he basically, turns away or leaves his best friend for a moment for friggin' pie and ice cream. Really, Chris? How is their relationship possibly going to remain after this sort of, I guess, betrayal? Chris has certainly done plenty of stuff that annoys Dan to no end, but this is the first time, it seems, that Chris really just basically went completely against his best friend and didn't even take Dan's side whatsoever. The journal that the imposter reads, with some unflattering drawings of Elise apparently, also contains some information that basically suggests that Dan finds Chris to be incredibly stupid, which I feel like the audience already knew, and I feel like in a weird way Chris already knew, but it wasn't something that he was either aware of or it wasn't something he wasn't about to accept. Like, I feel like he might have known that. Possibly. I'm not entirely sure. Honestly, Chris becoming aware of the fact that Dan finds Chris to be incredibly stupid probably just pushed him to, take the imposter's side, in addition to the pie and ice cream, since it happened basically in the same scene. And Chris should know Dan by now. He knows Dan enough to know that Dan is not going to give up to any challenge that's thrown his way, especially when it comes to revenge schemes. Like, I knew that later on in the episode, Elise knew that, but Chris could not seem to figure it out for his life. And Chris knows that Dan doesn't want to give up, but then he suddenly and stupidly believes that Dan is really trying to turn things around when he, takes on the persona of Biff Wellington and just gives the imposter his, social security and birth certificate and, official legal documentation and whatnot. Like, Chris believes it automatically. And I think one of the toughest scenes to watch, it was incredibly brief, but one of the toughest for me to watch was as soon as the imposter is arrested and the cop car drives away with imposter in tow, Chris runs out and just stands in the street and reaches out to the imposter. And he's clearly sad to see him go, but it's like, really? As weird and as nonsensical as the relationship is between Dan and Chris, I still find it fascinating to look at, and I still, in a weird way, root for them to remain together and to stay friends, because, frankly, I still think that that Dan needs Chris in his life, and I don't really necessarily think that Chris needs Dan, but, it might not be the worst thing, it might not be the best thing either, but I really do think that Dan is just so freaking dependent on Chris, and by extension Elise, at that point, that their relationship just needs to stay together, which is, again, another reason I think it would be interesting if somehow we got Dan and Chris at odds with one another. Like, because, again, we've seen the relationship at its strongest, but this is probably one of the lowest points that the relationship between the two of them has hit, because, again, Chris completely betrayed his friend. Completely and utterly. Personally, at least for me, it would be most interesting if, over the course of the second season, or maybe the second and third seasons, their relationship begins to deteriorate because of the imposter. Like, that would be fascinating to me. I don't think that's gonna happen, but that would be really fascinating to watch. Because I don't think that there was, a solid finale, because Dan vs. got canceled unexpectedly, so if there is some kind of episode like that, I don't think it would be like a season 3 finale. Maybe like a season 2 finale or something like that. That would be a good kind of finale to end on. At least, I hope so. I would hope so, because again, their relationship. These are two main characters here. Their relationship is practically integral to the show, and seeing it tested in some way. Because I feel like, again, Chris did betray Dan in this particular episode, and it was, again, really hard watching some of the scenes, because I know how much the relationship is central to the show, and in a way how much they kind of need each other. But I didn't feel like it was supremely tested like it could be. Because, we've seen Chris get mad before, but what happens if he gets supremely mad at Dan that he's not even gonna do anything for him, or maybe he's gonna move away or something like that? I don't freaking know. But I feel like this was not the most testing that their relationship could be, but it could be the start of a downward spiral in their relationship. Or maybe not, because, as soon as Dan gets what he wants and the imposter is arrested and he's no longer Biff Wellington, he immediately goes back to his old self and just casually asks Chris for a ride home like, nothing ever happened. So I could be completely wrong, and this series is also very episodic in nature, so I wouldn't be terribly surprised if it didn't really go down the route that I personally would like it to, but you never know. Yeah, after everything that Chris and Dan have been through, both as their own solo characters and together with their weird friendship relationship, whatever the frick it is, after all the ups and downs that have happened over the course of this season that we've seen so far, and probably plenty of off-screen moments between episodes and before the series ever even started. And this is how the season ends? With Chris going after the imposter and taking the imposter's side and just completely going against and practically betraying Dan? I really do question their friendship. Especially for future episodes. It would be interesting to see how it could change or how it could be tested. Again, I feel like that's something that needs to happen. I don't know why, but it's just, if there weren't so few characters and if their relationship wasn't so integral to the show, I might not even discussed it as much of length as I have in this reaction, and I think of maybe a couple of other reviews as well, or something to that effect. But this is the kind of stuff that I crave as a writer. This is the kind of analysis that I absolutely crave. I mean, granted, there are plenty of different kinds of people who can provide different types of analyses, but from a story perspective, from a writing perspective, from a character and a relationship perspective, this is what it's all about. This is what it means to do like a solid analysis, and like I have intense desires for their relationship to be tested. I don't exactly know if it's gonna happen. It might. I hope it does, because it would be a cool plot point if it did, even if it was for a single friggin' episode. Just saying. But yeah, those are the two big things that really stuck out to me over the course of this episode. Again, I find the Impostor to be a fantastic antagonist. It would be interesting to see him in the future, whether he's an antagonist. I feel like he should be an antagonist still, if he ever does end up becoming like a recurring character or something like that. Dan's personality was continuously questioned, and especially Dan's relationship with Chris, his friendship with Chris, was especially tested and analyzed to no end. Again, this as a writer is what I live for. But there are plenty of fun little other miscellaneous random nods and things that happen throughout the course of this episode, as is kind of per usual. I mean, the first thing being that Chris and Elise even have a contingency plan at all to reprogram Dan's mind should he ever snap, which is kind of a reference to a movie called The Manchurian Candidate, where something similar happens in Korea, or with like a Korean spy or something like that. I can't exactly remember for sure, but it also makes me wonder, like, how was this plan not utilized sooner? Because it feels like Dan has snapped a little bit on a few occasions. Maybe, I mean, it takes to this extreme with Chris thinking that Dan has multiple personalities to think that Dan has snapped enough to warrant like a shrink or reprogramming of any sort. And again, the thing with Miss Mumbles, the fact that she chose the Impostor over Dan, like, it was something that I think initially really bothered. It was the only major thing that really bothered me, and something I didn't necessarily like, but thinking about it, I guess it really reinforced my idea for considering Impostor to be, like, not necessarily a well-developed antagonist, but a well-thought-out antagonist at least, and made him seem like a lot more of a threat. And some fun little sort of, I wouldn't really call them nods, but like a little Easter egg in there was that we finally got to see Dan's driver's license, which I didn't really look at too much in my initial reaction, but I did definitely look very much at in my, like after the reaction had taken place. But I mean, Dan, because I think this show takes place at least in 2010. I haven't gone into too much detail, but I was able to do the math pretty easily, and Dan's basically confirmed to this point to be, at a minimum, 33 years old, again, based on the date of birth, as well as the date below the name on his license, which again, I hadn't known by this point. I'd still surmise that he was in his 20s when he was actually in his 30s. My mistake. Again, don't hold it against me. Please don't hold it against me. And it was actually really interesting to know that Dan is 5'6", making him as tall as me, which I would have guessed that he was a lot shorter. Like, I would have guessed he was probably closer to like 5'4" or something like that. I would have hoped to be a little bit taller than Dan, but I guess, alas, such a thing will not happen. He didn't seem quite... like, I feel like he was a bit shorter than that. It kind of makes me wonder how tall Chris is. He's probably close to 6 feet, if not at 6 feet. Something I actually hadn't noticed before was that Dan's driver's license, his ID or whatever, says that he has brown eyes when Dan clearly has green eyes, and yet the Impostor has blue eyes, and I have grayish green eyes, so what the heck is up with all these eye colors? But yeah, that is probably all that I have for this particular review. The Impostor was a fantastic antagonist. We got to see a little bit more of Dan and Chris's relationship. We got to see a legitimate threat to Dan, as well as, you know, a little bit more of questions / insight, but not entirely into Dan's personality. But there was so much to examine here. Again, there was so much to examine here. This is definitely intended to be the season 1 finale. There is a reason for it. It stinks that it wasn't aired as such, but I can absolutely see why this was intended to be the season 1 finale. It makes sense. It really does. But holy crap, was this a fantastic episode to analyze, and wow, 30 plus minutes for a review for a season finale? I'd say I've done some pretty good work if I do say so myself. But that is all that I have for this particular reaction and review and season, and not quite series, but there are 3 seasons, but the next 2 are much shorter than the first season, so technically I'm like more than halfway through. Or more than a third of the way through. I'm probably approaching halfway through, but not quite, if I'm recalling episode numbers correctly. I don't exactly know. But yeah, this is the end of season 1. Season 2 is probably not going to happen for a little bit, but I guarantee that seasons 2 and 3 reactions and reviews are going to be released probably both before the summer. I'll probably somehow overlap them a little bit with South Park, I'm not entirely sure. Second and third seasons will not be released as rapidly as these were. These will not be a daily occurrence. These will be, probably twice, maybe 3 times a week. It depends. No, maybe twice a week, because if I do anything too crazy, especially if I consider overlap, then it's just gonna get way too hard for me to keep up with everything. So, expect me to react and review to future episodes, and hopefully make this happen. I might also do a like top 3, bottom 3 list or something like that in the future. That may not happen for a little bit, but I'm probably going to be doing something like that. So yeah, I am actually glad to have gotten as much support as I did for reacting to this series. So thanks, guys. Thanks for enjoying this ride with me, and thanks for enjoying the reviews. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you probably didn't really watch them, but that is okay, because I'm still going to make them anyways. It could get me a little bit of watch time. I will admit, that's a big part of it. I mean, kind of the same for South Park as well, but that is all. That is all for this season. Season 1 is done. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for enjoying this journey and this ride with me. This was intense. This was very intense, but I'm not going to talk about that any further, because holy moly, my voice needs a break. So thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this reaction, this review, and this season. And as usual, until the next video, guys, check you laters.